Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Dispatch, episode 50. This is a milestone because it's a nice round number. Very, very excited. My name is Cameron English. I'm your host as always, joined by my co-host, Dr. Chuck Dinnerstein, Director of Medicine at the American Council on Science and Health, and joined again by Dr. Barbara Billauer, who we've had on the show multiple times, and I'm excited to announce is going to be joining us regularly to talk about bioethics and the legal aspects of many of the science and medical issues that we talk about. So Barbara, welcome back. Nice to have you with us again.
Thank you. And it's really nice to be here. This is my favorite chat of the day, of the week. Forget the day.
I'm blushing. Good. My goodness. Okay. Well, let's jump right into these stories. You two medical and legal experts here, because these are both controversial and I think there's a lot of very interesting facets that we have to at least try to cover. So this first one is another article by our colleague, Dr. Josh Bloom, who's the Director of Pharmaceutical and Chemical Sciences at ACSH. And he's talking here about Tylenol, and the title of the article gives it away, 6 More Years of Failure. So let me read this quick introduction. And then I'm just going to start throwing questions at you guys, since neither of you wrote this article, but I figure you probably have some thoughts on it. So Josh says, in 2017, I did an extensive search of Cochrane reviews that addressed the efficacy, or lack really, of Tylenol in controlling pain. With few exceptions, it did little or nothing. In the 6 ensuing years, there have been more published on the efficacy of the drug, and the message is the same. So I think basically here he's talking about primarily post-surgery in a lot of these studies. They're looking at whether you can give people Tylenol to address whatever pain they're experiencing. And it just seems to, if I'm reading this literature correctly, it seems to fail over and over in almost every case, unless you're talking about headaches. Is that correct, Chuck?
I think that is at least partially correct. It certainly works it works very well as an antipyretic for children. And a lot of the sales are directed in that direction because giving children aspirin comes with a completely different set of medical issues. So Tylenol really stands as the go-to drug there, and I think that a lot of the sales reflect that. With the decision that the opioid crisis was due to prescriptions by surgeons, there was a tidal wave of effort across the surgical community to find non-opioid ways of managing pain. And one of them that came along was the use of Tylenol in a intravenous form, so that you didn't have to worry about giving the Tylenol to the patient before surgery, where they might wind up aspirating it, or immediately after surgery when they may be nauseous and sick and not keep the medication down. And that Tylenol was shown in some study to have some efficacy, and the sales force came in, and you began to see more and more surgical practices using IV Tylenol, which was costing somewhere in the order of $500 compared to, 50 cents for the tablets. And so there's been a lot of pushback against that over the last few years. And I think that at this point in time, Tylenol remains an established analgesic. It doesn't have a lot of detrimental qualities, so there's not a big push by any group to find an alternative. So it just sits there and continues to be used, whether it's helpful or not. In my conversations with Josh, where I said that I took my Tylenol after surgery for my surgical pain, he said that was mostly a placebo effect. So perhaps he's right.
Let me read just a brief summary here of one of the reviews that Josh discusses in this article, and then I have a question for you, Barbara. So this was a systematic review, published in 2020. And they're looking at acetaminophen, that's Tylenol, and the effects it has on opioid sparing. So do people use less of these narcotic painkillers when they have Tylenol? So this is a quote. Josh says, perhaps worse, among the 16 active control groups, opioid consumption was significantly greater with IV acetaminophen than the active comparator in 7 cohorts and not significantly different than the active comparator in 8 cohorts. And that's the end of the quote. So Josh goes on to say, it basically seems like we have lost the plot here, in that this was supposed to reduce opioid use, and it seems to be backfiring. So my question to you, Barbara, is, do you think the push for Tylenol in these situations is driven more by the protocols that have been handed down above to physicians, and how much of this is them trying to comply with whatever regulations or fear of lawsuits compared to actually caring for their patients?
Well, let me say this. I'm going to contrast the American experience with the Israeli experience. As you both know, I spent 12 years in Israel, at which point I watched my husband suffer through open heart surgery, 5 hours of open heart surgery, and other major incidents. And NSAIDs are frowned on in the hospital setting mainly because of fear of bleeding, of course, as everyone knows here. My own view of Tylenol mimics Josh's, in that when I was taking graduate toxicology, we learned that Tylenol is a significant liver toxin. Now, in and of itself, if you only take Tylenol, your body has metabolic antidotes built in that would detoxify the Tylenol. It's only when you're taking other drugs or food that puts a drain on those specific antidotes and metabolites that you're draining the ability to detoxify the Tylenol, leading to liver disease, in some case, cirrhosis and cancer. I personally try to avoid Tylenol because the thought of taking Tylenol, and many people do this, and then downing a scotch or a glass of wine is very dangerous. And I had a friend who was diagnosed with liver cancer, and I said, this is about 10 years ago, this has to be secondary liver cancer because there's no such thing as primary liver cancer. And I said, Dick, when you took Tylenol, he had a pretty stressful job as a congressional something or other. Did you drink? He said, oh, you bet. I said, well, guess what? This is probably a liver cancer related to it. And his doctors gave him 3 months to live. I said, baloney. And he lived another 5 years, and it was not really a primary cancer in the typical sense.
No, that's a good thing.
Now, in children, as Chuck was mentioning, they're not drinking and they're not taking they're
not taking overwhelming doses of the medication. They're being dispensed by a parent.
Right. Especially one of the big drugs that impacts is birth control, and little children are not taking birth control pills. So they're not taking the drugs that would detoxify or reduce the liver enzymes that would metabolize the Tylenol. And so it's probably good for children. Now, what I found by the studies that were cited is in teeth surgery, in conjunction with NSAIDs, it works. And I can tell you, and maybe it's a placebo. Of course, everything could be placebo. It does work. But the interesting thing is that this is the custom and practice in my case, it was gum surgery, or it was invasive surgery. And this seems to be the standard of care in the specialized dental field. And so they're doing it, and it works, and it gets in the patient. So the fact that they're testing it signifies that this is a prevalent use, and the dentists are finding that it works, and it works better than one or the other. And the reason given to me by, I think I had root canal, was that, and Chuck can verify this, that the mechanisms by which Tylenol work differ from NSAIDs. NSAIDs address the inflammation. Tylenol might result in some kind of other nerve block or whatever. And so the double mechanism is more effective than single. Now, NSAIDs, of course, in that it is addressing the underlying or one underlying cause of pain, the inflammation or the pressure of inflammation, is a better idea because you're addressing the cause as opposed to the symptom, which is pain. But if you're in pain, that's debilitating.
Well, I think you raise an interesting point that gets lost in a lot of these studies is that one, pain is not a uniform quality and will vary significantly, not only between patients, but in terms of the site of surgical care. Bunion surgery is particularly painful. It's certainly more painful than a laparoscopic appendectomy. So when you bunch a whole different operations together, it's difficult to separate out the good and the bad effects. And the other important point you make is that sophisticated pain management today is multi-pharmacy, multimodality. That if you hit the pain in 2 or 3 different ways, you're going to get a far more effective response than the way I was raised, which was give them some morphine or Demerol and then give them an antiemetic to go along with it because they're going to be nauseous from what you just gave them. So I think that's an important point that gets overlooked across the acute pain literature.
And I don't think that the multimodality is used. It's certainly used in the dental field. It was used when I had another kind of surgery in America. They did prescribe it. When I had bunion surgery or close to it in Israel, they slapped opioids on me, which I promptly kept and didn't take. But you never know. You never know.
You're one of those ones where you're concerned about diverting. Okay.
Yeah, well, let's not say that. But I find it interesting that the multimodality isn't used more extensively. When I had a herniated disc, they threw Lyric at me, which had no effect other than it made me gain weight, which made me even more unhappy. So that didn't work. One drug that is used in Israel that is not used here, and it's not an opioid, is Optalgin, and it's like given out like candy there. Supposedly there are side effects to everything, but Optalgin is used as the second drug of choice after they can't throw Tylenol at you. They'll throw Optalgin. It works to some extent. Personally, I only find Tylenol working for headaches, and I would hesitate to say that that's Tylenol because a placebo effect, because it doesn't work on anything else. So if I'm willing to discount its effect on anything else, but accept it, and the NSAIDs don't work on, that's of course an anecdotal experience, but I don't think there's been enough research on the dual use of either Tylenol with NSAIDs, Tylenol with Optalgin, which is available here, but it's a prescription drug. It's not an over-the-counter drug. As opposed, now when Josh brought up that study that seems to indicate that Tylenol or acetaminophen increases use of opioids, that signifies to me that there is some kind of confounding effect involved. And if there's confounding effect in that study, we have to be very careful that the other studies aren't plagued by the same deficit.
I think it's interesting because I talked with Josh a little bit about that. What he was pointing out is that people were given the Tylenol initially and then given a rescue dose of an opioid, meaning given a dose because the pain was not relieved. So I don't know that it was so much that Tylenol had some kind of an additive response, but that it was clearly not adequate and that people needed to be rescued with a more effective pain medicine.
So then the question is, why were they given opioids directly as opposed to Ultram or Tramadol, which is a synthetic opioid, or Optalgin? Why rush to the hardcore opioids, or Lyrica or Cymbalta, or some of the other interim? Now, I don't find any relief from Lyrica, but Cymbalta does have a very good.
Remember that study was in an emergency room, so you're talking about a different pain threshold. You're also talking about people that can be anxious, and anxiety certainly heightens pain perception. So again, you have to look at the setting a little bit.
And that brings up another good point. as you pointed out before, different conditions cause different types of pain. Some pain can be relieved by electrical stimulation, transdorsal stimulators that interrupt the electrical pain flow. Anxiety, of course, exacerbates pain. Perhaps an adjunct dosage of Xanax or benzodiazepine might alleviate the pain. I think we're making this very bifurcated, very black and white. It's either Tylenol or opioids. And there are a panoply of different drugs that can be used alone or in combination that we're not really practicing on. And practicing is the word because we don't really have any data. So we've got to use them. Now, but I think the root cause of Josh's witch hunt on Tylenol is that it is a dangerous drug. It can be a dangerous drug, especially if one is using other drugs that deplete liver enzymes. And you've got to be careful about its use.
So the final question then on this issue, and this is to both of you, and it's based on the comments you made about tackling pain from multiple directions, Chuck. And it reminds me of what happens in agriculture with pesticides, which is something I know you've written about and I write about a lot. And I think it's the same sort of principle where there isn't a hard and fast rule. It's not like you use this pesticide all the time and this is a solution, or you use this one and this is a solution all the time. In reality, it's like, well, you're growing in a certain region, so maybe you use this chemistry. And then if you farm on another side of the planet, you use this one and you use it in different amounts and at, application times and rates and so forth. And basically it's like whatever weed pressure you're confronting, that's what drives the chemistries you use in your weed control approach or your pest control approach. Is that the solution here? I think that's what I'm hearing both of you say, is that for a certain surgery or a certain medical condition, controlling pain is going to be easier with this drug or this intervention or that intervention. Do I have that correct, first of all? And then how close are we to allowing doctors to do that right now?
Well, I think that every doctor finds for themselves what works for their patients. And so we kind of shift over time to what's efficacious in that setting. And it varies. I think that there's certain principles of pain management that are important, that pain management needs to preemptive to pain. It needs to be controlled by the patient to the largest degree possible. Those kind of generalities. What I think has happened is that with the advent, well, let me go back. When I was in my training, how I learned about pain medication was from the resident a year ahead of me who said, this is what we use. Okay, this is what we use. That's what I write. Today, physicians are no longer writing orders. The orders have been developed by committees. There are protocols for pain management that the hospitals or the health systems have put together. And so there is a more rigid hierarchy, a one-size-kind-of-fits-all approach to this, which may work for the majority of patients, but certainly doesn't work for everyone. And oftentimes the people that are left in pain tend to be very vocal about the issue. And so I think that there's a clash here in modern medicine between really being personalized and the thrust by the electronic medical record to make us very standardized.
And I also think that that physicians, for the most part, attract a fairly similar type of clientele, if only geographic, and weather, humidity, social pressures affect the way one perceives pain. And maybe we need to be more precise, at least on a geographic basis, on what works. Maybe more anti-anxiety medications might be more useful.
Oh,
Maybe
absolutely.
talk therapy might be more useful, or not alone, but certainly in conjunction with pain medication. Pain patients tend to be angry, justifiably. Uh, if there are ways, CBT, that can relieve some of that, that might also alleviate pain. I don't think we're being creative enough in terms of investigating alternatives to Tylenol or opiates.
Fair enough.
Yeah, good point. And again, these are a lot of the subtleties that get lost in the debate, especially in the headlines. So this is good for people to know. And interestingly, Chuck, your comments about protocols and medical review boards and all this kind of stuff. This is a good transition into our final story. And this is yours. So I'll read this introduction and you can just take it away. So this is called, "Do Physicians Have First Amendment Right to Speak Freely When Treating COVID?" And so you write, "In the fall of 2021, the Maine Board of Licensure in Medicine announced that licensees may face disciplinary action should they," and this is a quote, "generate and spread COVID-19 vaccine misinformation or disinformation." And then you point to a physician named Meryl Nass, and she's a Maine family practitioner, and she had her license suspended for this very reason in January last year. And she's suing, claiming a First Amendment right to speech. Okay, so with that out of the way, jump in here and give us the highlights. What do we need to know about this story?
As is often the case, I had a bias going into it, and as is often the case, that bias got turned around a little bit the deeper I dug. I think my general bias is that the physicians that have spoken in public forums against public health measures and suggesting some strange medications for treatment are doing a disservice and are, air quotes, bad docs. So I went in with that, but I feel a little bit differently as I dug deeper into it. And the quote that hit me was from that Yale Law Review, and saying that if being a member of a regulated profession does not result in the surrender of your First Amendment rights. And as is the case with law, and again, as I said before we began today, I'm always a little nervous when I'm having this conversation, and I know there's an attorney here. The law recognizes several different kinds of speech, and I'm starting to believe that the medical board in Maine has perhaps overstepped its bounds and authority. I think that basically there are several kinds of speech. There's commercial speech, which we know is hyperbolic and where it always ends with "this has not been approved by the FDA." That kind of speech, I think, has already been addressed. Professional speech is the speech that I have with a patient. So there has to be a physician-patient relationship established. This is the speech that takes place when I do an informed consent, when I look at the various treatment options, when I make recommendations. And to a large extent, while I may say what I believe is in the best interest of the patient, tort law, specifically malpractice law, represents the counterbalance to that. I can say whatever it is I want, but if it's not considered part of the standard of care, then I may very well be liable for malpractice litigation and costs. Public speech, which is what the Maine Medical Board initially pulled her license for, is the kind of speech that you find when we write about a generality, where we're talking to the public. We are not talking to a patient. Now, the Maine Board subsequently dropped that part and pulled her license over documentation and other problems, which kind of gets obscured in some of the places that you read about it. But overall, I think that it's important for us to make a distinction between professional speech, where I'm engaged with the patient and where tort law already seeks to be a counterbalance, and public speech, my public utterances, even with my halo of being a doctor, in the public square, where I have more latitude on a free amendment basis. And having said that, I'm going to leave it to Barbara.
Well, first, thank you for writing that article. I think it's a topic that needs to be better understood. I first became interested in this subject matter in 2018, long before COVID, in conjunction with the worldwide measles epidemic. And at that time, you had the same cast of anti-vax characters, the exact same cast. And in fact, they used their measles anti-vax tropes and mechanisms in COVID. They just struck out COVID, the measles, and stuck in COVID. And when I first started looking for a way to literally muzzle in the doctors, the academic community, the legal academics, the First Amendment constitutional lawyers, who by and large are very liberal, pulled back. No, we can't have the government telling people what to say. Well, they didn't look particularly at measles as a particularly dreaded disease. And one of the leaders, who's someone who I admire and who's a superb leader in legal education, said, my neighbor is against anti-vaccines, and she's a doctor, and she doesn't seem like a crazy. Well, we know there are plenty of doctors who are anti-vax. So I think we have to do a couple of slicing and dicing here. What information is being disseminated and for what purpose? So the measles epidemic was targeted to the Haredi population who not just in the United States, and 75 to 80% of the American measles cases in 2018, 2019, there are about 1,200 cases in the country, 75 to 80% arose from two communities in New York, and the anti-vax groups targeted these communities. Now, how did they target them? They had symposia conferences where the anti-vax activists, amongst them doctors, got up and said wrong, flawed, fake information about the efficacy of vaccines. And they didn't do it just in Israel. They did it in England, and they did it in London, and they did it in Israel. And pretty much the script was exactly the same. They took CDC graphs. They monkeyed around with the graphs. They changed the denominator. They changed the numerator. And my husband, who is a PhD in economics, so he's not a doctor, although his father was, I believe this. And I had to point out to him the fraud that was being used. Now, the New York Attorney General at that time, there was a doctor who got on the stands and was saying all the typical anti-vax stuff. Vaccines are bad. You all know the language. And she said she couldn't go after him for precisely the reasons that Chuck was telling us. He's not talking in the context of a physician-patient relationship. He's talking to a group of people in his personal capacity. Baloney. And I will say it again, baloney. They recruited this guy precisely because he had an MD before his name. And okay, and so his talking to this group about vaccines, because he held on his head MD and had a practice trying to dissuade people from taking vaccines. And some of those doctors killed people with that practice in California and otherwise. They are very dangerous people. So what does the law have to say? Well, the law does talk about professional speech, not very clearly. It's kind of sandwiched in the commercial speech that you measure. Fraud speech is outlawed. But what is fraud speech? Fraud speech means knowingly, with malice or with recklessness, putting out information that's designed to force people to act in a particular way. Well, what are these doctors doing who are saying untruths about vaccines, but trying to convince them to act in a way that not only is dangerous to them, but is dangerous to the public health? But then we have to separate out public information relating to vaccines that is absolutely false and fraudulent and malicious, like RFK saying vaccines have never worked, and he says it in a debate against Alan Dershowitz. I mean, it's on, I don't know unless they've removed it, it was on the internet, which is, as far as I'm concerned, qualifies for it. What he wants people not to take vaccines. He's telling absolute untruth. So that's fraud. With information about masking or information about certain drugs, which is not as cut and dry as somebody, and Chuck, you pointed this out in your article, all of the fallacies that people are recounting the efficacy of vaccines or the safety of vaccines. They're manipulating the data in ways that they should know better. So when you have physicians playing games with the data, and in fact, I'm sure you all read, there's the dean of Stanford Law School is being asked to step down, losing tenure. There's a woman in Harvard, not medicine, because they played around with the data. Well, how come it doesn't apply to doctors who are impacting not just on individuals' health, but on public health? So before I get into solutions, because there are some solutions that people have to agree with, I hope, you have to separate out, I think, the type of speech and the absolute knowledge that the law, that it's false or not. Now, I have to say this, false speech is protected. This is U.S. versus Alvarez. You're allowed to lie. And that should shield people. But when you're sworn to uphold the public health and you're sworn to your guild not to do any harm, I think you have a higher onus. And I will.
But that onus should that onus be addressed by the guild, not by the.
So yes.
That's really quick. That's a very good question. I want to add another element into this before you answer, Barbara, because I want to muddy the waters a little bit and give you a chance to clarify what's going on, because this is confusing to me. So let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. And Chuck got a lot of comments to this effect on his article. If people want to go read that, a lot of people said, well, who gets to decide what misinformation is or what disinformation is? And that prompted in me the question, what happens when you have, ostensibly authoritative medical institutions and universities and hospitals and so forth disseminating information that's factually incorrect? So, for example, a few weeks ago, Chuck and I talked about the CDC with a straight face telling the world that men can breastfeed, which is absurd on his face. But the more important point for our discussion is that often involves taking certain medications off-label that are illegal in the U.S., and that can have very serious side effects. So
yeah, it causes birth defects.
Correct.
It causes birth defects.
Right, and I think heart arrhythmias and sudden death. It's really nasty stuff if you're not prescribed it for the right reason and the right dose and all that, whatever. But the question is, and I think you guys can see where I'm going with this, is that the institutions that ostensibly would be the source of information for any kind of protocol or any kind of speech guidelines are often saying things that are utter nonsense. And you have the CDC, but then you have like the American Academy of Pediatrics has already said gender affirming care for minors is perfectly justified, and we're doing our systematic review right now. We'll get back to you. So they've already said, here's our conclusion. We're gathering the data right now, and we don't have to get into any of these issues in particular. But I think you guys understand what I'm saying is that you have institutions that are making determinations that are not based on high quality evidence. And then they're going to turn around and say, well, now I'm going to regulate your speech as a physician because you're disseminating misinformation. So take that, Barbara.
Okay, here's the drum roll. So this is the exact same objection I got when I raised this in 2018. Who gets to decide? And God forbid the government should decide we want to get the government out of this. And I agree. So who gets to decide? And the answer is really simple. The people get to decide. And I said this the same way in a court of law, where you have to decide whether scientific evidence proffered is valid and reliable. And yes, there are standards, and I'm writing an article that the standards should be changed, but the information is put before a jury, and a jury decides whether the evidence that the gray hairs, that we call them, get on the sand, and this side says this, and this side says this, whether that information is valid or accurate. And when RFK Jr. says that there has never been been a disease that vaccines have successfully eradicated, I think it's pretty clear that a jury would say that the guy, has problems with the truth. Let's put it that way. And I don't think that should be allowed because it's dangerous. And it's not a question of the marketplace of ideas, which is what the con laws want to stimulate. It's a question of putting forth falsities so that RFK Jr. can get an income and maybe have his ego stroked. Now, when you get questions like masks, and the CDC has put out some disastrous information, I don't think the CDC should be the arbiter. I don't think HHS should be the arbiter. I don't think an elected official should be the arbiter. I don't even think, as you point out, the American Academy of Pediatrics should be the arbiter. I think the evidence get put through 6 or 12 people who are intelligent enough, and they sit and they plow through this and they say, this is good science and this is dreck. And if you don't like it, then you can appeal it to a higher court or a higher court up, and that's who gets to decide. And I don't see why that's a problem.
I think that there's. I'm sorry, Chuck. Go ahead, please.
No, go ahead, Brooke. Go ahead.
So I think there's some viability to that idea. I think the one concern I have, and we see this with institutions like IARC, for example, once you set up a governing body or an authoritative body on a given question, they are liable to be influenced and even to be corrupted on some occasions. So maybe the solution is you have multiple bodies of experts who can look at the data amongst themselves and maybe discuss, have some cross-pollination, if you will, and then come to a determination. Because I can see the questions that somebody would ask, right? This is a very fraught situation that you've brought up. Maybe it's better than, the CDC hands down some silly edict and everyone has to pretend that it's true, but it still doesn't seem like a seamless solution. Thoughts from either of you on that? Okay,
so here's the RX situation, and I know which study you're referring to, and I haven't read the study. I can't say it, but I have read other IARC studies. If you're a decent lawyer and you're trying to show that the IARC conclusion is wrong, you don't just say, well, they got paid off. You say, on what did you base it? Well, I base it on, okay. One of the reasons that RFK's group says that vaccines are bad is because it causes depression. Okay, very good. On what basis did you make that study? Well, we have 2 studies. One was done in sheep. I kid you not. One was done in sheep and the sheep were sleepy, and the other was done in mice, and the mice didn't react well to other mice. And that's proof of autism. Give me a break. I think most jurors can figure that out. If you take the underlying studies upon which the group relied and you put the underlying studies out to them, and that includes meta-analysis too. Juries, at least, are really smart. And you have a collective body of 6 intellects. If you can take that stuff, and if you're a good lawyer, you can, and make it understandable, they can see through all that garbage. But you have to take it apart step by step, and it's painstaking. You've got to tell the jury before you select them, listen, we're going to go through scientific stuff. And I tell this with law students, and they say, oh, if I want to learn science, I would have been a medical doctor, not a lawyer. Well, then get out of my class. Because you have to understand it. And juries can, in my experience.
But, that invokes the legal system, which is not necessarily the case if I were to say, I believe that vascular surgery is the best answer to this public health problem of pain when walking. Now, that's something we can argue back and forth, and it's my opinion, not really, but I don't see a place there for the legal system to come in and say, you're spreading truths because there's medication for it, there's exercise for it, and you may harm somebody by doing that. Now, I think that there may very well be a role for my professional society to say this is not the standard of care that we present, and we don't think that you should any longer be a member of our organization. And I think that there may be somehow a role for the medical boards to say you're spreading malicious, there's an intent at that point, malicious information, and therefore we have to pull your license on the basis of ethics.
Well, you could start there, and once the medical association, that could be the first line of defense, and once the medical association enters a finding of fraud and malice, then you have, I would think, could be held to have violated the First Amendment if your desire is to fraudulently induce certain behaviors in others, such as not taking a vaccine.
Okay, but wouldn't you agree that it is difficult to demonstrate intent in many instances? And when we talk about I think that a lot of the people that talked about using ivermectin were well-intentioned, misinformed individuals. They were not being malicious.
Okay, so that's a good example. So the people who advocated it, you might be able to put a certain blanket over them. But the Zelenko protocol, which number one involves the administration of some antibiotic and zinc, and that's what spearheaded it. And I went through. I didn't check the hydroxyquinone, but no, he was hydroxyquinone. It was hydroxyquinone, zinc, and some antibiotic. I didn't check the ivermectin, so I don't have anything to say about ivermectin. But hydroxyquinone, I could find no study, none, where they investigated hydroxyquinone alone. And that means those few studies that showed some benefit from zinc and antibiotics, obviously, it could have come from the zinc and the antibiotics. Now, can I prove intent or recklessness on Zelenko's part? I think I can. Zelenko never saw the patients he prescribed to. He was dying of some other disease for which he died. He needed the money. He had a nursing staff answer telephone calls and just prescribe it. That is reckless behavior. That would not be acceptable behavior in the medical profession. And so by his actions, I think you can prove that Zelenko recklessly advised the drug. And then I was entered into a conversation with Dr. Rich, who's an epidemiologist, I think at Yale. And other than calling me that lady and she doesn't know what she's talking about, proceeded to produce some idiotic epidemiological factoids, which had nothing to do with anything. Now, what he was getting from it, I don't know. But when a respected epidemiologist succumbs to this, there's some problem, and somebody should have investigated it. But you certainly, I think, could have gotten Zelenko for reckless misspeech.
And let me just jump on that for a second. And that's malpractice. That's malpractice, and all the examples you gave were violations of a physician-patient relationship.
Except that he went on.
Well, so if he then goes on and says, in my experience, this protocol has worked.
No, he didn't. He got on podcasts and he made blanket statements about how wonderful it was and convinced other people, including a friend of mine in Israel, who knows nothing from nothing, how wonderful it was. And he featured him in an interview. And here's Zelenko marketing his Zelenko protocol for which he got paid.
Okay. And so now we've taken it that's interesting, because now we've taken it that one step farther, because while I would give a physician a break who talked about this and said, in my experience, this is what's worked.
Right.
I draw the line when we talk about America's frontline doctors, because they turned around and sold a product.
Right. And that's the danger. And so all those good-natured doctors who thought they believed got it from him, or mostly from him. And if you can shut up the source, then the good doctors who were just stupid and didn't check the data by themselves like I didn't review every single study to show that there wasn't any pure hydroxyquinone study, would have been quieted. There was another doctor that was cited who said before he tried the Zelenko protocol, half of his patients died. And afterwards, it was miraculous. It was wonderful. And most lived. Now, of course, that's not a gold standard, and his patients weren't randomized or anything else. But interesting enough, the guy was a diet doctor, which means his patients were all obese. On the witness stand, you would say to him, how many obese patients die with or without the drug? 92% or whatever the number is. And he's basing it on a prejudice sample. And you would show that the sample is biased, and most jurists would say this is really wrong and fraudulent information. And to draw conclusions in your protected, you have a certain sanctimony as a doctor. Yes, it's not the way it was in the 50s and the 60s, but it's still there. And to make false conclusions because you're getting money out of it, I think, is it affront to your guild? But it's also affront to humanity. And that's what the First Amendment allows prosecution for speech that encourages imminent danger. The First Amendment is not absolute. We allow suits for defamation. What's defamation? Defamation is damage to one's reputation. Why shouldn't we allow suits to damage to one's life?
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So if somebody is falsely making a statement, now some of the statements that were made were not false. The masking statements were not absolutely false, and the CDC made plenty of false statements too. But some of the statements were absolutely false. The hydroxyquinone statements were false. And then when Trump got on and said it was wonderful, that was false. And when my cousin who's got a ministry said, oh, I had COVID and I took hydroxyquinone and his ministry all took it, that's false. What does he know? That shouldn't be allowed. That's irresponsible speech. That's kind of like shouting fire in a crowded theater in the context of COVID. Not so much measles, but certainly in the context of COVID, where every case caused another case to happen. Now, what can be done about it? Because as much as I think doctors who are spouting absolute, provably false speech, i.e. that vaccines have never worked, and most of the con law community is against that. Well, there are two things, one of which you made is government speech. And I have an article about this. And government speech would take the form of a curriculum in school where children are taught the basics of immunology, not advanced, but vaccines do work and why they worked in polio and smallpox and stuff like that. And that can be done. The government can order schools to teach a not a gender neutral, but a science neutral class. Now, interestingly, in the trans situations or the breastfeeding situations, where you have, certainly in the trans situations, where you have a totally different viewpoint in Europe, and there's serious questions as to the temporal relationship of the findings and the results. In other words, these are clearly disturbed children. Clearly, they have some form of body dysphoria. They don't like their body. That's not necessarily to say that they don't like their body because it's male or female. They don't like their body. They are depressed. They are suicidal. But there's a question as to whether the impetus for their dissatisfaction or that which generates a suicidal ideation or actual suicide may not be gender triggered. It may just be because they don't like their body or they're not happy or something else. And there's a lot of question about that, which the Europeans have reached already. So that might be something else. The other thing that can be done is what's called compelled speech. Compelled speech we see on cigarettes. So the cigarette companies can advertise the cigarettes, but they are required to put a warning on cigarettes, and in some cases a graphic warning. Any physician who gets up and says COVID vaccines are bad has got to be required to hand out a monograph from some kind of impartial group saying, but here's the other side. And that's legal.
Interesting. I think we need to come back to this topic again because I have some very different feelings about compelled speech or what that Yale Law Review called government speech.
No, they're two different things. And I have problems with that article. She does not parse things down as carefully as she could. It was written in 96 before measles. I check some of the sources she used. They're not parsed out as finely as you would like, because government speech and compelled speech are two different things. They may both be problematic, but they're just two different things.
I think we are nicely illustrating just what a mess the modern medical system is in the United States and how many complicated issues we probably will never solve. But nonetheless,
we haven't solved it again. Oh,
there's a long-running joke, Barbara, on this show between Chuck and I that we talk about bad news and we rarely have solutions because there's just so many variables involved. But I think we're making progress in that we're actually talking about what might work, and whether it does or not, at least we're discussing some possible answers. So we'll come back next week most likely, and we'll try to dive deeper into this, and then we'll have another story. We won't talk about Tylenol again, but we'll talk about something else. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. You can follow us on social media. The organization is at ACSH.org. I'm at Cam J. English. Website is acsh.org. And Barbara, I don't think you have social media, but do you want to direct folks to anywhere besides our website so they can find out more about your work?
Your website is great.
Very good. Check it out. You can just type in Barbara's name and find all of her really, really interesting and insightful work. And with that, we will see you next time. Oh, go ahead.
They can look on my SSRN page. Just go to Barbara Fevre-Billauer at ssrn.com, and you've got some of the 100 plus articles I've written on there. And then I've starting writing now for the Harvard Bill of Health. They can look on the Harvard Bill of Health website also.
Excellent. Check out those resources. Come back next week for episode 51.
Cool.